This week we will be discussing the specifics of primate behavior, and this will include um, things like feeding behaviors, social grouping, reproductive behaviors, and the possibility that primates may have culture. So, our objectives include explaining why behavioral ecology is an important framework for understanding the evolution of behavior among primates, and this includes humans. What we're really doing is setting the stage then for being able to objectively analyze human behavior. We will describe some of the factors that are used to explain why primates are social, how dominance hierarchies function within primate societies, some of the differences between male and female reproductive strategies, and then evidence for culture in many non-human species. We'll briefly talk about some that are not even primates. Culture, of course, one of its hallmarks for humans is our sophisticated use of language. And so we will talk about primate language. And then we will tie everything up with a discussion about what we call the biological and behavioral continuum, where we exist as biological creatures just on one end of that continuum. So we have to start. If we want to discuss behavior, we've got to have a good working definition of behavior. So behavior is defined in biology as anything that organisms do that involves action in response to either internal or external stimuli. So the response can be at the individual level, it can be at the group level, it can even be how species respond to their environments. It may or may not include deliberate choices. So there are some higher taxa, such as birds and mammals, where behavior can be incredibly complex, and much of that can be described as voluntary or deliberate behavior. When we look at kind of lower levels of taxonomic organization, microbes, fish, amphibians, reptiles, etc., we see more examples perhaps of what we would consider hardwired or instinctual or non-deliberate behavior. When we talk about these complex behaviors, even among higher taxa, we still recognize that behavior is shaped over evolutionary time by interactions between both genetics and environmental factors. And so we can say with certainty that some behavior is at least biologically determined or genetically based, but much of our behavioral pathways are flexible based on environmental input. We also recognize that, at least among humans, we perceive that ourselves, we have this tendency to perceive ourselves as different, that we are somehow exceptional or unique, that we are put upon a pedestal, that we are somehow not subjected to these same kinds of quote unquote animalistic instincts as other species. However, we really do a disservice to understanding our own behavior if we constantly set ourselves to the side as exceptional. Because if we really want to understand what causes certain behaviors, we need to understand the evolutionary circumstances that shaped that behavior. We talk in kind of the philosophy of science about something called the naturalistic fallacy, and particularly one framework of that, the is-ought fallacy. The idea that what is natural is somehow morally preferable and good, what is unnatural is somehow immoral or viewed as bad. And so the naturalistic fallacy can be applied to humans in contexts like sexuality, a biblical justification of conforming to heteronormative sexual norms. The idea that in order for reproduction to happen, that you have to have male and female, then therefore anything that deviates from quote unquote normal is somehow morally unacceptable. If we tie religion into it, it could be this idea that God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, therefore homosexuality is unnatural and morally unacceptable. When we really examine kind of the evolutionary bases for many behaviors, we can find evidence for things that humans would generally consider undesirable or immoral. So we can find an evolutionary basis for warfare, for killing for sport. We can find an evolutionary basis for aggression against women, extreme mate guarding of males by female or of females by males. We can find kind of an evolved basis for things like infanticide and other forms of infant abuse, so on and so forth. So, what we need to restrain ourselves from doing is applying some kind of moral viewpoint to the behavior that we're examining. If we want to be able to minimize behaviors that we as humans consider immoral or unacceptable, then we need to understand the full kind of explanation of causality for those behaviors. All right, so behavioral ecology is a subfield of um, biology that looks to study evolution of behavior, emphasizing the role of ecological factors as agents of natural selection. Therefore, the behaviors and behavioral patterns have been favored because they increase the fitness, particularly reproductive success, of individuals in certain environmental contexts. One cornerstone of behavioral ecology is that behaviors evolve through the operation of natural selection in the same way that anatomical traits have. Therefore, behaviors can be considered a phenotype, and that phenotype can influence fitness. Studying these complex behaviors from an evolutionary standpoint does not imply what we would consider one gene, one trait. So there's not going to be, for example, a behavior or a gene for aggression, a gene for altruism, a gene for sexual promiscuity, a gene for, any particular behavior that we can think of. It also doesn't suggest that genetically influenced behaviors can't be affected or influenced by learning. So, just because a behavior has an underlying genetic basis doesn't mean that we can't learn to modulate that behavior, or that we can't learn perhaps certain expressions of that behavior given certain environmental input. And so behavior is kind of the ultimate in terms of these complex interactions of genes and environment. I teach a course over at UNM that's called the Human Life Course that examines human behavior from this behavioral ecology perspective. And one of the things that we discuss pretty early on in the course is the idea of phenotypic plasticity, and how it applies particularly to behavior. The idea of phenotypic plasticity is that we can get variable expression of a phenotype even when we're holding genotype constant, that is a response to certain environmental stimuli. And so we can talk about biological traits as being plastic or having quote unquote reaction norms, but we can also talk about behavioral traits as being plastic. So one example I like to give of a physiological trait that is plastic is red blood cell density. If you have the desire to someday summit Everest, you're going to have to train pretty heavily for that, but you're also going to have to devote enough time to your trip to allow yourself to quote unquote acclimate at the various base camps. And it is through that process of acclimatization that we see a very phenotypically plastic physiological response. When people live at high elevation, low oxygen concentration consistently, there are a number of ways that they can adapt to that. They can have this barrel chest, this more highly vascularized lungs, and so forth that are more long-term adaptations, or they can boost their red blood cell density. And this is more of a short-term physiological adaptation. It's one of the reasons why people that engage in endurance kinds of sports like marathon running, Leadville 100, things like that, often train at high elevation. Within about 2 to 3 weeks of training at high elevation, your bone marrow is naturally going to produce a higher proportion of red blood cells per unit volume of blood. This is essentially what's going on through blood doping, where you may either inject red blood cells specifically into your bloodstream, or you may take medications that artificially stimulate the overproduction of red blood cells, but it happens naturally when you train at high elevation. And when you go back and run your race at low elevation, you've got a competitive advantage because you've basically done legal blood doping. That is an example of a plastic trait. You're not changing your genotype between low elevation and high elevation. You are changing the physiological response, and the pressure that it's kind of mediating, or the environmental stimulus that's that is allowing for that response is the underlying oxygen concentration. At high elevation, there's less oxygen per unit volume air. At low elevation, oxygen density is higher. So at high elevation, we increase our red blood cell density so that we can bind any and every oxygen molecule that we come in contact with, versus low elevation where oxygen is plentiful. We don't need to have as many red blood cells because we're not going to struggle getting oxygen to the rest of our body. When we talk about a behavioral trait that demonstrates phenotypic plasticity, I like to bring up the human diet. In a modern context, you can be entirely vegan and not eat any animal products. When, as we move forth next week and talk about hominin evolution, we're going to talk about the important role that consuming meat had in our overall brain evolution. Yet, in a modern context, we don't need any meat, right? If you're eating a vegan diet, you do have to supplement with some critical micronutrients, vitamins, minerals that you don't get from plant products, but in this modern context, that's fairly easily done. Even when we're looking at subsistence economies, and in particular hunter-gatherers or foragers, we generally see most populations somewhere on the spectrum between about 40% protein, 60% carbohydrate, to 40% carbohydrate, 60% protein. However, we recognize that some populations, like the Inuit, have 9 months out of the year where they're eating 80, 90, almost 100% hunted game with very little carbohydrate material thrown in. So even in subsistence economies, particularly hunter-gatherers, we see a great deal of flexibility in kind of this optimal human diet. And dietary composition is absolutely a behavioral trait, not a physiological or anatomical trait. One of the things that can vary pretty widely among primates is their underlying social structure. The social structure is the composition, size, and sex ratio of a group of animals. We'll talk about it in a few slides, where the most basic unit of social organization for primates is a mother and her dependent offspring. But we can see quite a bit of variety across different primates in like their group size and their group composition. There are factors that are related to what we consider life history traits that influence social structure. One of those is body size. Now, in biology, across a lot of taxa, we have a relationship that we call allometry. Allometry scales certain life history and developmental traits to body size, so that larger animals tend to have quote-unquote slower life histories. In a future slide, we'll call this K-selection, versus smaller bodied species that tend to be R-selected. So larger bodied species will have a longer gestation length, a slower pace of development, a later age at sexual maturity, a longer interbirth interval when they do reach sexual maturity, more of a commitment to singleton or very small litter sizes, and tend to live to pretty old ages, versus those of small body size that have a short gestation length, fast growth rate, early age at first reproduction, large litters, high reproductive output, small interbirth interval, and a relatively short lifespan. So we find this continuity across taxa, and it includes non-human primates, with a special caveat when we talk about humans. Our life history traits correlate to our brain size, not to our body size, and our brain size it indicates us as an outlier among other primates. So the larger the body size reduces metabolic burden. Groups can therefore be larger because per animal or per unit weight, we're not requiring quite so much food. Similarly, basal metabolic rate relates to group size. Lower basal metabolic rates, which happen to correlate with larger body size, reduce overall caloric needs. Thusly, they enable different diets that allow for larger group size. For example, leaves don't give you as much energetic bang for your buck. And so if you have a diet that's fairly reliant upon leaves and other vegetative growth, grass, etc., you can kind of bear the burden of larger group size, versus those animals that have less ubiquitous resources that have higher feeding competition. Therefore, that brings us to our next bullet point with diet. Diet influences feeding competition, which greatly influences social structure. Leaf eaters tend to have larger group sizes generally than fruit eaters do. Um, Similarly, as we look across and we compare leaf eaters to fruit eaters, folivores to frugivores, we tend to see a higher degree of sociality among groups of frugivores, meaning that they've got more social intelligence or what we call Machiavellian intelligence. Their social relationships, when they're there, are a lot more complex. I mean, we can compare, this to a species like cattle, right? Cattle are not exceedingly smart. They have large group sizes because their diet allows them to have large group sizes, and because large group sizes relate to the last bullet point here, predation. But they're not really keeping track of all the dyadic social interactions of everyone in their group. We compare that to canids. Let's think about wolves. Wolves have smaller group sizes than herds of livestock like cattle. But because they're bearing a harder, a higher level of feeding competition, they've got to have some degree of social savviness. And so we see, for example, strict dominance hierarchies that emerge among canids to kind of facilitate or mediate the conflict that arises over feeding competition. The distribution of resources also influences social structure. Ubiquitous resources, those that are everywhere, like leaves, favor larger group sizes. Things that are patchily distributed, like fruits, favor territoriality, and then also favor that larger degree of sociality in terms of that social intelligence. And then lastly, predation. When predation pressures are high and body size is small, larger groups can be advantageous. So that maybe seems counter to this relationship of body size, where generally larger body sized animals are have larger groups, but we can see then among smaller bodied animals larger group sizes kind of predicated by really high predation pressures. Patterns of dispersal influence social structure. Generally, across most mammals, one sex or the other generally disperses. When females leave, they tend to solitarily join another group. When males leave, there may be a period of solitary living or even the formation of what we call bachelor troops. This affects the social complexity. We're more likely to see bachelor troops arise or even this period of solitary living when we've got one male, multiple female social systems, for example. So the only way that males can gain access to breeding females is through some kind of competitive takeover of another male's group. Dispersal is related to two major factors. One is that it reduces competition between males for mates, and the second is that it reduces the likelihood of inbreeding. Because we've got at least one sex or the other dispersing, we can also then see a kind of sex-based difference in how they mediate competition and disputes, in how kind of social hierarchy or rank is mediated. Life histories influence social structure. We've got this allometry, this correlation of body size with lifespan, pace of development, and pace of reproduction. Long-lived species typically have more complex social arrangements than do short-lived species. Also, species that are focusing on high reproductive output often can't bear the costs of increased feeding competition. So because of that allometric relationship, that small body size is going to be associated with what we call simulparity, or kind of putting all of your eggs in one basket, both figuratively and literally, having all of your reproductive success determined by one reproductive event, and thusly you're not going to bear these higher rates of feeding competition that come with larger group size. Activity patterns influence social structure. Nocturnal lifestyles are more likely to be associated with solitary foraging or very small groups. And then human activities can influence social structure. I mean, human predation, human driven habitat loss, can reduce numbers of primate populations. They can isolate and fragment groups, so that even if groups would prefer to be organized into larger group sizes, they may not have that opportunity because of how humans have affected their environment and their available resources. So we recognize that primates are among some of the most social of mammals. I mean, there are other groups of mammals that are consistently social, canids being one, cetaceans being another, but primates tend to demonstrate fairly large group sizes, and so we need to analyze both the cost and the benefits of those group sizes. The most important cost of large group sizes, particularly for the kinds of resources that many primates eat, those fruits that arose kind of with the advent of angiosperms, flowering plants that are patchily distributed both spatially and temporally, it's going to be increased feeding competition. So the benefits then to larger group sizes have to outweigh this cost of increased feeding competition. One of those benefits is predator defense. This is going to be much more important in what we call mixed woodland or savanna style habitats because the predators in mixed woodland and savanna habitats are going to be larger. There are also going to be fewer places to hide. We think about living out on the African savanna. Primates climb trees. Primates climb trees when threatened. Primates climb trees at night to sleep. So without this availability of trees to climb, what is a monkey to do when a predator approaches it, right? By having larger group sizes, you may be able to detect predators earlier and alert everyone to the fact that a predator is approaching. You also lower the likelihood that you yourself as an individual will be taken in that predator attack. Another benefit of large group size is the ability to compete for resources with other conspecifics, so other members of the same species. This relates specifically to territoriality. So when we think about chimpanzee troops, for example, they competitively exclude other groups of chimpanzees from their feeding territories, and males will ally and actually patrol the boundaries of territories and will more competitively defend things that are more highly valuable. So nut groves, for example, provide a lot of protein and are calorically dense, and chimps have a heavy preference for eating nuts when nuts are available. So that way, being able to exclude others from access to your feeding territory increases your own group's individual access to feeding territories. The third is protection against infanticidal males. One of the harsh realities of primates is that babies get killed. Babies have pretty high mortality, and males are sometimes the perpetrators of infanticide. Females are too, though it's for different reasons. We'll talk about this in the second part of the lecture. But males typically kill infants that are not their own biological offspring, and so by having larger group sizes, for example, we've got a picture here of baboons. When baboons kind of work together and have larger group sizes, other females with whom you build alliances, and even other males who may either be the genetic father of that offspring or just maybe long-term friends, they're able to help you avoid any aggression by the dominant male who may seek to kill your infant. So we can't knock the fact that infanticide has at least been one of the selection pressures that primate groups have had to cope with. And so when we've got a strict degree of sociality or a high degree of sociality, when we've got this emotional and social complexity, we need to have mechanisms in place to be able to both keep track of it and to mitigate it. When we've got high levels of feeding competition, for instance, there's one of two outcomes. One is that it can just be a rampant free-for-all where everybody's fighting and everybody's getting hurt. The second possibility is that somehow we have mechanisms in place that can mitigate or kind of determine individuals' access to resources, and we often find this mediated through the formation of dominance hierarchies. Dominance hierarchies are systems of social organization wherein individuals within a group are ranked relative to one another. And having high rank then is associated with what we call priority of access to critical resources. These resources can include water, food, or access to estrus females or mates. The primary benefit of dominance is increased reproductive success for higher ranking animals. This can be through both mate access and through, particularly for females, access to larger quantities of food. We'll talk about why that is in a few slides. We often find that, particularly among the group where or the sex that is not dispersing, that dominance hierarchies can be pretty consistent across the lifespan. And so when we talk about Cercopithecines, these are macaques and baboons. For Cercopithecines, rank is fairly stable. We've got, in fact, what we call ranked matrilines, where females, when they're born, assume the dominant status either one position above or one position below their own mothers. And so large kin groups monopolize certain tiers of rank. And this is consistent across the life course, and this mediates growth and development in these females' infants. This is mediated through the stress response. Robert Sapolsky wrote a great book called A Primate's Memoir that talks about his life and times with savanna baboons who are Cercopithecines. And I mean, that cortisol response has far-reaching consequences across the lifespan in the way that it mediates the secretion and kind of processing of other hormones. There can also be situations where rank may change frequently. Among Cercopithecines, male rank changes pretty frequently. The high status sons of high status females enjoy priority of access prior to weaning, but upon reaching adolescence, these males are going to have to battle their way, for baboons at least, and many macaques, into another troop. So they're going to have to be kind of this prime virility and physical prowess, so that they can competitively gain a foot in the door of some other troop. For baboons, males will often enter at the highest level of dominance. However, their dominance is going to be pretty consistently tested. So even though alpha status is associated with priority of access to resources, they may be so busy fighting other males that that's not going to translate then into higher reproductive success. As males age, their physical competitiveness drops, which means correspondingly, as new males fight their way into the dominance hierarchies, that their rank also precipitously drops. So we see in one species, savanna baboons, a difference in the stability of rank among these strict dominance hierarchies, from the consistent ranked matrilines of females to the very flexible, rapidly declining ranks of adult males. Rank and then the behavior appropriate for the rank are then learned through observations of one's mother, and through interactions with others. This can be true through play interactions. This can also be true through approaching other adults in the group and kind of whether you're coddled or rebuffed. Generally, high-ranking females are able to have kind of a laissez-faire approach to raising infants. That is, they're able to let their infants roam because there's no fear of kidnapping and thus mothering infants to death. High-ranking females among Cercopithecines will outright kill the infants of lower ranking females, or they may just kidnap them and not let the moms get them back until their health is starting to decline. Because if it's a female who's not lactating, that kidnapped infant's not going to be able to eat. And so we call this mothering to death, and it's really quite common. So low-ranking mothers have to be more protective. They generally won't let their infants get farther than about an arm's length away. They will aggressively maintain contact with their infants, dragging them back to them if they start to stray too far. They also are more likely to demonstrate appeasement gestures, which we're going to talk about on another slide, like lip smacking, like kind of the fear grimace, etc. So a lot of the social behaviors that infants of low-ranking mothers are learning are those appeasement gestures, which are just going to solidify that overall lower rank for that offspring. In contrast, the infants of high-ranking mothers are going to grow up with that benefit of access to whatever food they desire, and these kind of carefree and easy interactions with other individuals, which is going to kind of reinforce overall that relatively high rank.